Blackridge, Montana, 1952. The blizzard struck with an unexpected ferocity that January, catching even the most weather-hardened locals by surprise. Wind howled to the mountain passes, dumping snow in drifts that swallowed fences and buried the lower halves of doorways. The temperature plummeted to 20 below zero, freezing pipes and killing livestock caught in the open. In the small logging town of Blackridge, most residents hunkered down to wait out the storm, gathered around with stoves and fireplaces, listening to the wind rattle their windows. But not everyone had that luxury. James Porter, the town's 42-year-old physician, was last seen heading out on his horse through the swirling snow after receiving word that Old Man Calloway was having chest pains out at his remote homestead. Porter stuffed his medical bag with supplies, wrapped himself in his heaviest coat, and mounted his sturdy Morgan horse despite his wife Catherine's tearful protests. "They're saying it's the worst storm in 30 years, she argued, clutching at his sleeve. "Can't it wait until morning?" "If it's his heart, Kate, waiting could kill him," Porter replied, his breath visible in the freezing air of their front porch. "I'll be back before midnight. Keep the lamp burning." He bent down from the saddle to kiss her goodbye, his mustache frosted with ice crystals already forming from his breath. Then he straightened, pulled his scarf higher over his face, and nudged his horse forward into the wall of white. The lamp burned all night in the Porter home. It burned the next day and the next as the blizzard raged for 3 relentless days. When the storm finally broke, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine white drifts under a crystal blue sky, a search party set out to find Dr. Porter. They found his horse first. If this story has pulled you in so far, take a second to tap that like button. It really helps us bring you more incredible mysteries just like this. And while you're at it, subscribe to Gone Cold and turn on the notification bell, so you're always the first to know when we uncover another chilling, real-life mystery that refuses to stay buried. Frozen to death in a ravine 2 miles from town, the medical bag still strapped to saddle. Of Porter himself, there was no sign. The searchers followed what they hoped were his tracks, difficult to distinguish in the snow that had been sculptured by the wind. The trail led them up into the densely forested foothills, where tracking became nearly impossible. For 2 weeks, nearly every able-bodied man in Blackridge joined the search, combing the forests and hills for any trace of their missing doctor. They found nothing, no body, no clothing, no sign that James Porter had ever ventured into those woods. It was as if the blizzard had simply erased him from existence. In town, theories abounded. Some believed he had fallen into a ravine or frozen pond, his body hidden beneath snow and ice. Others thought he might have sought shelter in a cave or hollow, only to succumb to the cold before help could arrive. A few whispered that he had simply abandoned his life, using the storm as cover to disappear and start fresh elsewhere, though none dared voice this theory to Catherine Porter's face. As winter gave way to spring, hope faded. The melting snow revealed no body, no clues. Catherine refused to hold a funeral without proof of her husband's death, but the practical realities of life forced her to move forward. She packed away his closed his medical practice, and eventually moved east to live with her sister in Pennsylvania, a widow without a grave to visit. The people of Blackridge gradually stopped talking about Dr. Porter. New stories and tragedies took precedence, and the mystery of his disappearance became just another tale told during long winter nights, embellished with each retelling until it took on the quality of legend rather than recent history. And deep in the mountains, as seasons turned and decades passed, a secret lay waiting, preserved by isolation and the harsh Montana climate, untouched by time itself. Blackridge, Montana, 2022. "I'm telling you, this isn't on any of my maps," said Mike Lawson, squinting at his GPS unit. At 43, he had been hunting these mountains for most of his life and prided himself on knowing the terrain better than most locals. His hunting partner, Tom Chun, shrugged his shoulders. "Maps miss things, especially up here where the satellite coverage gets sketchy." He adjusted his rifle strap and glanced up at the darkening sky. "We should find shelter soon. That storm's moving in faster than they predicted." The two men had ventured farther into mountains than they'd initially planned, tracking a promising elk herd that kept moving just beyond shooting range. Now, with daylight fading and weather closing in, they needed to make a decision. backtrack toward their truck, which would mean hiking through the night, or find a place to wait out the incoming snowstorm. "Hold up," Tom said suddenly, pointing through a gap in the pines. "Is that a structure?" Mike followed his gesture, catching a glimpse of something distinctly unnatural among the trees. Straight lines where nature created none. They changed course, pushing through underbrush that seemed undisturbed by human passage, emerging into a small clearing half hidden in a fold of the mountainside. Before them stood a cabin, small but solidly built, its logs weathered to a silver gray. Snow covered most of the roof, but the structure appeared intact, almost as if it had been maintained. Yet the absence of footprints or smoke from the chimney suggested otherwise. "Probably an old hunting cabin," Mike said, approaching cautiously, "though I've never heard anyone mention one in this area." The door was secured with a simple wooden latch, frozen in place with decades of ice and grime. Tom used above his rifle to break it free, and the door swung inward with a groan of protest from rusted hinges. The interior was dim, illuminated only by the fading daylight filtering through a single window clouded with dust and frost patterns. But what the hunters could see stopped them in their tracks. The cabin looked as if its occupant had just stepped out momentarily. A cast iron stove stood in one corner with logs stacked neatly beside it. A small table held a tin plate and cup, a kerosene lamp, and an open book. A bed with a wool blanket occupied another corner, and various supplies, canned goods, tools, clothing, were arranged on shelves and hooks around the single room. "Jesus," whispered Mike. "It's like a museum exhibit." Tom moved further inside, his experienced eye taking in details. "Look at these cans. They're ancient. And that calendar on the wall, 1952. He pointed to a yellow page showing January, hung from a nail near the stove. Mike joined him, examining the items on the table. The book was a medical text, its pages brown with age. Beside it lay a small leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and faded. With careful fingers, he opened it to find neat handwriting filling the pages. "January 14th, 1952, he read aloud. "The storm shows no sign of abating. My supplies are adequate for perhaps another week, if I'm careful. My leg continues to trouble me, but I've managed to set it as best I can with limited materials. When the weather clears, I'll attempt to reach town, though the distance is considerable." Mike's voice trailed off as he looked up at Tom, realization dawning on both their faces. "You don't think?" Tom began. "Check for a name," Mike urged, his voice hushed despite the isolation. Tom gently turned the journal to its inside cover, where an inscription was written in the same careful hand. "Property of James Porter, M.D." Outside, the first snowflakes of the approaching storm began to fall, swirling in the wind much as they had 70 years earlier, when a country doctor had vanished into a blizzard, never to return. The storm that trapped Mike and Tom in the cabin lasted through the night, though it was mild compared to Montana's legendary blizzards. By morning, a fresh blanket of snow covered the landscape, but the sky was clearing. The hunters, having made themselves reluctantly comfortable in the preserved time capsule, decided to document everything before hiking back to civilization. "We need to contact the police or park rangers," Tom said, carefully photographing the cabin's interior with his phone. "This is clearly some kind of historical discovery." Mike nodded absently, absorbed in reading Dr. Porter's journal by the daylight, now streaming through the window. The story it told was both tragic and remarkable. According to the entries, Porter had indeed reached Old Man Calloway's homestead and treated him for what appeared to be indigestion rather than a heart attack. On his return journey, the blizzard had worsened dramatically, and his horse had panicked when a snow-laden branch crashed down nearby. Porter was thrown, breaking his leg in the fall. The horse bolted, leaving the doctor stranded in worsening conditions. Porter had managed to drag himself through the snow, following the game trail up into the relative shelter of the dense forest. By extraordinary luck, he stumbled upon the abandoned trapper's cabin just as his strength was failing. The cabin, likely in use for years even then, contained enough basic supplies for survival: matches, some preserved food, blankets, and firewood. The journal chronicled his attempts to treat his compound fracture, his rationing of the limited supplies, and his hopes for rescue once the storm abated. But the entries took a darker turn as days passed with no sign of searchers. The snow was simply too deep, the location too remote, and Porter's inability to travel hampered any self-rescue attempts. "Listen to this entry," Mike said, reading aloud. "February 1st, 1952. 1 month since I've seen another human face. My leg has healed poorly. Infection sent despite my best efforts, and I've had to resign myself to the fact that I will never walk properly again if I survive at all. The pain is manageable with willow bark tea, though my supplies of food are growing critically low. I've managed to set a few snares by crawling out on clearer days, but my success has been limited. The isolation weighs on me more heavily than the physical discomfort. I think constantly of Catherine, imagining her grief. The cruelest part is knowing that I am merely 5 miles from town as the crow flies, yet might as well be on the moon." Tom looked up from his own examination of the cabin's artifacts. "Does it say how long he survived?" Mike flipped carefully through the remaining pages. The entries continue through February, becoming shorter and more sporadic. The last one is dated March 18th. He read the final entry. "Snow melting at last. Spotted a deer from the window this morning. The first living creature I've seen in weeks. Too weak to attempt a journey to town now, even though the path might finally be passable. Strange how clear my mind feels even as my body fails. I find myself making peace with my fate. My only regret is Catherine's uncertainty. I hope someday someone finds this journal, so she might know I didn't simply abandon her. I fought to return until I no longer could. The fire will last another day if I'm careful with the wood. After that..." The journal ended there, the final thought unfinished. The hunters fell silent, absorbing the reality of what they had discovered. The final resting place of a man who had vanished from the world 70 years ago, whose disappearance had become part of local folklore. "He died here alone," Tom said quietly, "waiting for a rescue that never came." Mike nodded, carefully closing the journal. "But there's no remains." They both glanced toward the bed, half expecting to find a skeleton beneath the blankets, but it was empty. A more thorough search of the cabin revealed no human remains. "Maybe he managed to leave after all," Tom suggested. "Made one final attempt to reach town. Or animals got in after he died," Mike said grimly. The door latch wasn't exactly secure. They gathered the most significant items: the journal, the doctor's medical bag found under bed, and a sealed envelope addressed to Catherine, my beloved wife, that they discovered between the pages of the medical text. These they carefully packed to bring back to authorities. Before leaving, they stood for a moment in the clearing, looking back at the cabin that had served as both sanctuary and prison for James Porter in his final days. 70 years, Mike said softly. All this time, no one knew what happened to him. His wife died never knowing. Tom checked his GPS, marking the coordinates. Not anymore. Now his story can finally be told. As they began their trek back to civilization, each man carried more than physical items from the cabin. They carried the weight of a long-lost story, a final chapter of man's life that had remained hidden for 7 decades in the unforgiving Montana wilderness, preserved like an insect in amber, waiting for the world to rediscover it. The discovery of Dr. Porter's cabin made headlines across Montana. Local news crews interviewed Mike and Tom, while historians and forensic experts descended on the remote site, carefully cataloging and preserving everything inside the cabin that had stood frozen in time for 7 decades. Elizabeth Carver, the county historian and curator of Blackridge's small museum, took special interest in the sealed letter addressed to Catherine Porter. Now in her 60s, Elizabeth had grown up hearing stories about the doctor who vanished in the Great Blizzard of '52. Her own grandfather had been part of the search party. "We need to find a Porter descendant," she told Sheriff Wade Taylor as they stood in his office, the letter still unopened, in an evidence bag between them. Catherine never had children with the doctor, but she had a sister in Pennsylvania. There might be nieces or nephews. It took 2 weeks of research and numerous phone calls, but Elizabeth finally located Catherine Porter's grandniece, a 67-year-old retired teacher named Margaret Winters living in Pittsburgh. After explaining the situation, Elizabeth arranged for Margaret to come to Blackridge. Margaret arrived on a crisp October afternoon, a dignified woman with silver hair and the same blue eyes that looked out from the faded photographs of Catherine Porter in the town's historical archive. My great-aunt rarely spoke of her husband. Margaret explained to Sheriff Taylor Elizabeth, and the two hunters gathered in the museum's private room. The not knowing broke her heart. She lived another 30 years after his disappearance, but never remarried, never stopped wondering. With trembling hands, Margaret opened a letter that had waited 70 years to be read. The paper was fragile, but had been well preserved in the dry cold of the cabin. Dr. Porter's handwriting was weaker than his journal, but still legible. My dearest Catherine, if you are reading this, then someone has found my final refuge, though I fear it will be long after I am gone. I want you to know that my last thoughts were of you. Every day of our separation, I've imagined your face, heard your laughter in the howling wind, felt your presence in the emptiness of these mountains. I made a grave error in judgment the night I left, believing my duty as a physician outweighed the danger. By the time I realized my mistake, it was too late. My broken leg prevented any hope of returning to you on my own, and the remoteness of this cabin made discovery unlikely. Please know that I fought to survive as long as I could. When I realized that I would not see another spring, I made a decision. Rather than wait for death in this cabin, I chose to meet on my own terms. When I finish this letter, I will use my remaining strength to walk into the forest one last time. I do not wish my body be found here, a grim discovery for some future traveler. Instead, I will become part of these mountains that have both sheltered and imprisoned me. Do not mourn too long, my love. Find happiness again. Know that I died thinking of you, with no regrets except the pain my absence has caused. Forever yours, James. Margaret wiped tears from her eyes as she finished reading. She never knew all those years of uncertainty. At least now we know why there were no remains in the cabin, Mike said quietly. He chose to die outside. Elizabeth nodded solemnly. A final act of dignity, and perhaps kindness, too, sparing whoever found the cabin from discovering his body. Sheriff Taylor cleared his throat, visibly moved despite his professional demeanor. We'll organize another search of the area around the cabin. After all this time, there won't be much to find, but Dr. Porter deserves a proper burial if possible. Margaret folded the letter carefully. Catherine is buried in the cemetery in Pittsburgh. If anything is found, I'd like him to finally join her. They've been separated too long. As they left the museum, snow began to fall gently over Blackridge. The first of the season, a reminder that winter was returning to mountains where a man's final chapter had remained unread for 7 decades. The search for Dr. Porter's remains proved as challenging as everyone expected. Despite using modern technology, ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs trained to detect even ancient remains and systematic grid searches, the dense forest and rugged terrain kept its secrets. Just as the search was about to be called off for the season, with winter closing in on the mountains, a volunteer found something in a small ravine about a quarter-mile from the cabin, a pocket watch, tarnished but intact, with the initials JP engraved on the back. Nearby, partially buried under decades of forest detritus, lay a few human bones. Forensic analysis confirmed what they already knew in their hearts. James Porter had indeed walked into the wilderness for his final rest. From the location and condition of the remains, experts determined he had likely sat down against a tree, overlooking a vista of the valley below, perhaps thinking of the town and the wife waiting there, and peacefully succumbed to the elements. 1 year after the hunter's discovery, on a bright autumn day with leaves turning gold and crimson in the Montana sunshine, Blackridge held a memorial service for their long-lost doctor. The small cemetery on a hill overlooking the town had a new granite headstone, though the remains themselves had traveled east to Pittsburgh, to be interred beside Catherine as Margaret had wished. The service was well attended, not just by curious locals, but by Porter descendants from across the country who had learned of their family's history through the news coverage. Mike and Tom stood at the back, still somewhat uncomfortable with the attention their discovery had brought. Elizabeth Carver unveiled a small exhibit at the town museum, featuring Porter's journal, now carefully preserved, photographs of the cabin and its contents, and the story of the country doctor who had sacrificed his life attempting to help others. Among the displayed items was a framed copy of the final letter, alongside a photograph of the reunited headstones in Pittsburgh, James and Catherine Porter, together at last. As the ceremony concluded, an elderly man who had introduced himself as Catherine's cousin approached the hunters. "My mother was just a girl when it happened," he told them. She remembered how Catherine would put a lamp in the window every night for years afterward, just in case. He paused, emotion catching in his voice. "Thank you for finding him, for bringing him home." That evening, as darkness fell over Blackridge, Mike Lawson stood on his porch looking toward the mountains. The cabin still stood up there, now designated as a historical site, its contents cataloged and largely removed for preservation. But the structure itself remained, a silent sentinel to one man's endurance, dignity, and love. From his pocket, Mike took out a small object the museum had given him as a keepsake, a compass that had belonged to Dr. Porter, its needle still pointing faithfully north after all these years. He thought about how Porter had used this same compass in his final journey, choosing his own path when options had run out. Sometimes the most remarkable stories are hidden in the quiet corners of the world, preserved by chance and isolation until the moment is right for them to be found. A doctor vanished in a blizzard. A cabin stood frozen in time. And 70 years later, a mystery was finally solved, bringing peace not just to the dead, but to the living who had carried the weight of uncertainty through generations. The mountains kept their vigil as they always had, unchanged by the brief dramas of human lives. But in Blackridge and in a cemetery in Pittsburgh, the story of Dr. James Porter had finally reached its proper ending. If this discovery gave you chills, show your support by liking this video and subscribing to Gone Cold, so you don't miss our next deep dive into a story that will keep you thinking long after it ends. But more importantly, I want to hear from you. What's your theory? Do you believe Dr. James Porter's disappearance was just a tragic accident in the blizzard, or is there something darker at play? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and let's see which theory rises to the top.